Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. This evening I'd like to talk about some of the underlying philosophical concepts behind the Dhamma, such as the nature of mind, the nature of reality, and voidness, emptiness. To begin with, I should say that we're talking about these kind of things. We, at best, can only approach it an approximation. And remember the Zen injunction of not mistaking the finger for the moon when we're talking about very deep structures of reality. We're working with models of reality. We're not working with reality itself. This is something that is inherent in a lot of the Buddhist teaching from various sources, that the ultimate nature of reality is not to be captured with play words. It's something that can only be approached ultimately by direct experience or realization, that we're dealing with pointers to reality or models of reality. Lately I've been reading a couple of different books dealing with these themes. That's why I'm thinking about them. One is a book about Huayan Buddhism, a Chinese school of Buddhism that grew out of the Yogacara from India, and also informed by the Prajnaparamitas. And also been reading Bernardo Kastrup, a modern philosopher on the nature of mind and reality. When we approach these questions, the first obvious principle to begin with is that all we really know directly is our own mind. And this is an obvious truism, that all we experience and know is mediated through the mind. It's famous in Western thought that Descartes made the statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which is actually a non sequitur. He's putting that I in there, so he's already making a unwarranted conclusion in that first statement, but he's starting from that point, that the only thing that we can be really sure of directly is our own mind. And everything else beyond that is an extrapolation or an inference. We know the mind directly. We know there is mind. This is all we can know immediately, directly, a starting point. The external world, this is a point that Kastrup makes, the external world, the material world, is actually an inference. We infer that there is an external world because we have perceptions of it that concur largely with those of other people. So we assume there must be a common reference. So there's a logical deduction that an external world exists, but it's not something that we know by direct experience. We know our perceptions. We have sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And these are mental processes within our own mind. and the external world is, as we know it, a creation or a simulation built by perception on these sense inputs. Now we know one of the fundamental tenets, maybe the fundamental tenet of Buddhist thought, is sunyata, or emptiness. And this is a something that's been interpreted in different ways and talked about a lot and extrapolated upon. One of the concepts in Indian philosophy generally was the idea of swabhava, own substance or own essence, or self-essence, self-existence. This was something that is explicitly denied as having a reality in the Abhidhamma, and I found in the Huayan tradition they make a big point of denying this, saying that a implicit belief in a swabhava is the root of all delusion, beginning with naive realism, and all false perceptions and understandings of reality begin with this implicit assumption, which is a natural way of thinking. It's how we grow up assuming things have a intrinsic reality. Things have an intrinsic essence or substance. But they actually, if you look into the nature of things, you can't find that. The expression, things don't exist from their own side. This is another idea that is greatly developed in Huayan Buddhism, is the idea of mutuality. That things, we say in Theravada tradition, we more often say conditionality. That things are conditioned by other things. That things depend on other things. That nothing can be isolated as an absolute unit on its own with a substance. It's only a reflection. And everything interpenetrates and depends on other things. One of the parables given in one of the Huayan texts is a master teaching a disciple in a room with a mirror. And the mirror is the sign for the Dharmadhatu, or the universal reality, and or tatata is a phrase from the Pali expressing a similar idea. And the master is the Buddha, represents the Buddha, and the disciple represents sentient beings. And when the master's teaching his disciple, the disciple exists within the mind of the master, and the master exists within the mind of the disciple. And the mirror reflects the both of them. So when you are interacting with another sentient being, that being exists in your mind. You're actually dealing with a perception of that being, and that being is dealing with a perception of you. So there's an interpenetration of reality. And nowhere do you find an actual, completely independent, isolated, self-existent entity. I found it interesting that both the Huayan school and Kastrup's writings are based on a form of idealism. This is the philosophical position that the only reality is mind. I don't find that position explicitly stated in the Theravada Abhidhamma, but in the Buddhist teachings, as we find in the suttas, there's always this practical orientation. The Buddha was not really interested in expounding on metaphysical questions. He was interested in the existential dilemma of being suffering in the world: birth, sickness, old age, and death. And how do we make an end of this? So it's a practical teaching, and concern with metaphysical questions is actually somewhat discouraged by the Buddha. There's the famous parable of the man shot with an arrow. That if a man is shot with an arrow and a physician comes to help him to take the arrow out, and the man says, before you take the arrow out, I need to know what kind of wood the shaft was made from, what kind of stone the head was made from, what kind of bird the feathers came from, who shot the arrow. Was he a nobleman or a peasant? Was he tall or short? By the time he got an answer to all these questions, he'd be dead. That the only important thing is to get the arrow out. So we don't find the Buddha either taking a stand on these metaphysical issues, but he did, in different places, in different ways, state the primacy of mind as the, if not, maybe it is or it isn't the only reality, but it's the primary reality. As the very first verse of the Dhammapada is, mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief. The body follows the mind like the cart follows the ox. The Huayan model does take the position of mind only, explicitly. It has its roots in the Indian school of Yogacara, which is also called Chittamitta, the mind-only school, with the underlying teaching or assumption in that model is that mind is the only reality, and that the physical universe is just an expression of mind. In the Yogacara model, there's it is a quite natural extrapolation of the idea that our perceptions create the reality that we actually live in. So whatever the metaphysical status of the external world, we can't ever directly know that. We only know our own mind. And the Yogacara position is that the external world is nothing but essentially a dream. Our perceptions create the external world. At night when you're dreaming, your dreams are, your perception is completely free, so you make stuff up out of fragments of memory and imagination and whatnot. In the waking life, your perception still works in the same way as dreaming, but it's constrained by sense impressions. Now, the idea in Yogacara is the sense impressions are coming from our past karma, which is also a principle in Theravada Abhidhamma, that all moments of sense impression are karma resultants. But I think Yogacara takes it a little step further in saying that the karma not only determines the reality we experience, but it actually creates it. And the reason why beings perceive a common reality is because of aeons of time of continual rebirth and so much shared karma that there's a storehouse of shared karma that creates the external world. This idea actually finds some expression in the Theravadan cosmology, in that in a new world age, when a new world comes into existence after the destruction of the old world, the force that causes a new world to come into existence is the karma of the beings that died in the old world. That their karma is the energy that generates a new universe for them to be born into. The modern philosopher Kastrup, who has a extensive background in physics, he takes a kind of interesting twist on this, beginning with the idea that mind is the only reality we can be sure of. He asks, why is it that beings have seemed to exist as individuals and we exist in our own little islands and have our own perceptions and thoughts that are not accessible to other beings. And he compares it to, which I thought was a kind of clever idea. I don't know what to make of it, but it's intriguing as a concept. The idea that in the universal mind, individual beings are like the alters of someone with multiple personality disorder. That we're little islands of crazy in the universal mind, and the external reality are those contents of the universal mind that are common, that are accessed by all minds. And he makes the point, which I think is a sound one, that the findings of quantum mechanics are most easily explained if we assume at least the primacy of mind, if not the singularity of only mind. As quantum mechanics has found that at the finest grain level, reality only exists as a probability wave. And it only appears to concretize when it's observed. So consciousness is required for manifestation of reality. And something tying all this together is that primary tenet of Buddhist thought of sunyata, of emptiness, the emptiness of all dhammas, of not having an own essence. There's the Prajnaparamita text, the Heart Sutra, that's probably familiar to most of you. The statement, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. This text was one of the root texts of the Huayan school. They took extrapolated a lot of their thought from that particular text and that particular statement in particular. For example, one little nugget that I found that I thought was interesting was using that statement to interpret the difference between samatha and vipassana. Samatha is seeing form as emptiness, and vipassana is seeing emptiness as form. Now, if you're doing samatha, you're taking a nimitta, an object like your physical breath or a kasina or a mantra, and you're making that sole object of consciousness. And in the end, it becomes seen, as empty. With vipassana, you're taking an interest in the objects of consciousness, the dhammas that rise from the void and return to the void. So you're seeing the forms thrown out by the void. This statement from the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, is very important, very deep. The emptiness, sunyata, is not something separate from form, and form is not something separate from emptiness. Form is an expression of emptiness, and emptiness is inherent in form. So one of the points the Huayan makes is that the emptiness is not to be seen as the emptiness of annihilation, because there's nothing to be annihilated. That things are already inherently empty or void from beginningless time. In the Theravada teaching on the dependent origination, which is also found in other schools of Buddhism, there's the it's an expression of how this whole mass of suffering comes to be. Or, in other words, how form and manifestation arises. And it's considered to be beginningless. It's a cycle, but for purposes of explanation, it usually begins with ignorance. And because of ignorance or avijja, then everything else arises. So this means not having a partial or incomplete or wrong understanding of the totality, the tatata or the dharmadhatu. Having an incomplete understanding of that, there's beginning this, from the very beginning, there's inherently a kind of a brokenness, a fragmentation. So it's because of not seeing the totality that we collapse the wave function, and we get a manifestation of some particular reality that's determined by our karma. So from that ignorance, that not knowing, that partial expression of the total reality, then beings make karma acting in that way. This is sankhara, is the next step. So they're in this broken, fragmented reality, and they thrash around. They knock things over and bust stuff. This is the creation of further karma. And consciousness arises, vijnana arises in that milieu and out of that milieu. When a new being comes into existence, like in the human case, at the moment of conception, new being arises in the womb of the mother. It's determined, its place and its site of rebirth is determined by the karma it made previously. And now we have a being that comes into existence imbued with name and form and the six senses, and it experiences contact, which is the perceptions, and this arises feelings and craving and clinging and becoming and birth, old age, sickness, and death, and throws the being back into ignorance. And all this is being played out in the great emptiness. None of it has any self-substance. It's all conditioned. And this is the core teaching of dependent origination, that the statement of the dependent origination in its simplest form is this arising, that arises, this ceasing, that ceases. In other words, an expression of causality, of this linking, this interpenetration. So nothing can be isolated as a unit. Another of the parables from Huayan is Indra's net, which is a very beautiful image of the god Indra has in his palace as a decoration above his throne. He has this three-dimensional weave, his net, a cross-hatching of very thin silken fibers, and wherever the fibers intersect, there's a jewel, a multifaceted jewel. And if you examine closely any jewel in the net and any facet of that jewel, it reflects the rest of the net, including all the other jewels and all the facets in an infinite regress. One of the Huayan masters, who was had one of the emperors of China as a disciple, he demonstrated this principle physically. He had built a room that was mirrors on all walls and ceiling, and hanging from a thread from the roof was a Buddha image. And when you look in any direction, you see an infinite regress of Buddhas going off in all directions. This illustrates the interpenetration of all reality. It's stated in Abhidhamma as one of the principles is that nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. And the Huayan extrapolation of that is that the entire reality is reflected in each mode of dust. That everything is dependent on everything else infinitely, in an infinite regress. Another one of their concepts is a pair of terms in Chinese is Li and Shi. Li is universal law. Maybe close to the Pali Dharmatata, the universal law. And Shi is particular manifestations, which could be a dust mote or a planet or a human being or whatever, particular manifestations. And each particular manifestation, each Shi, contains within itself the entire Li. But Li is not thereby reduced, and the thing is not thereby expanded. So that actual manifestations of stuff are just a playing out of universal laws. They're not a thing in themselves. They're just an expression of forces and vectors. And the totality of the universal laws contained in each object. So we come around again to a starting point. One of the big questions of not only of Buddhism, but I think of all human thought ultimately is what is mind? What is this thing we call mind? This is in a way is the ultimate koan. It's something you can contemplate and work with your entire life and unfold new dimensions of understanding. It's a really an intriguing riddle because it is the only thing we know ultimately, but it's also ultimately beyond our understanding. Mind has the quality of experiencing, of knowing. So that inherently makes it unknowable. Because how do you turn it in on itself? It's like you cannot see your own eyes. Whenever you attempt to understand the nature of mind in the sense mind as the knower, as chitta, or puru, the knowing quality, whenever you try and look at it, all you can see is a reflection or an idea of it, which then becomes an object of consciousness. But the ultimately subjective cannot then become an object. And all things play out in this field of mind, all of the whole universe. There's the Zen story of the two views of mind. The one monk holding that the mind is like a mirror set up in a high place that illuminates the 10,000 things and reflects them in its face. And the other monk says, well, that's close, but what I hold is that the mind is like a bright mirror that illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in its face thereby. It's also reflected in the sixth patriarch stanza. The fellow who ended up becoming the sixth patriarch of Zen critiqued a stanza written by another monk that said he was expressing his practice as I keep the mirror polished bright so that it clearly reflects all things. And this fellow who became the sixth patriarch, he said this nonsense. What mirror, what dust, no need to polish. So this is something very important and intriguing to work with and to contemplate, is the nature of mind. Because mind is ultimately all that we know, but it's really beyond our knowing in another sense. And what we're trying to do with our practice is to understand, to develop that wisdom of understanding the true nature of reality, and the beginning point must always be our own mind. And we experience multitudes of objects on a momentary basis, external and internal. We experience sense impressions, we experience thoughts and emotions, but what is doing the experiencing? Who is the owner of the empty house? Well, I think that's enough for now.
Andamayam Kamakaya Sadhu Karam Daramase.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.